Good afternoon and a guten Erev Shabbos. Great to be learning with you on a Friday. Let's light up the darkness. Who's in the house? Bella in Florida, Melissa in Great Neck, Yehuda in South Carolina, Gordo in Scotland, Shandora in the Bronx, Guy in Ohio, Karen in Northern California, Renee in Indiana, Joe in the Inland Empire, Paula in the Great Northwest, Joseph in Lowell, Massachusetts, Marjorie in Georgia, Marie in Freeport. Welcome, everybody. A double daf, and not an overly long day, but we get to get a day ahead. I don't know that we've ever been ahead before, but don't worry, it won't last long. After today, we'll be a day ahead. We should be able to have our regular class Saturday night, tomorrow night. Sunday, I'm traveling to Florida and planning to broadcast from my father's house Sunday night. So that should work out fine. But then Monday and Wednesday of next week, I will not be able to teach because of my obligations to the Maccabee USA golf team that I'm coaching. And we're having our qualifier this coming Monday and Tuesday for the Maccabee Games in Israel next summer, 2025. Okay, we are moving into chapter 2 here in Tractate Bava Basra, the 23rd volume of the Talmud, opening Mishna number 1 of chapter 2. Our dafs today are pages 17 and 18 here in Bava Basra. Okay, very good. The Mishnah number 1. A person may not dig a pit close to the pit of another in order to avoid damaging the second pit. And similarly, one may not dig a ditch nor a cave, i.e. a covered pit, nor a water channel, nor a launderer's pond, which is a pit used for washing clothes, unless he distanced all of these 3 handbreadths from the wall of another, and he plasters lime on the place where there is water. And one must distance the solid residue of produce that has been pressed free of its oil, for example, the refuse of olives from which oil has been squeezed, and animal manure, and salt, and lime, and rocks, 3 handbreadths from the wall of another. In other words, the wall of your neighbor, as all these items produce heat and can damage the wall. Or alternatively, he may plaster the wall with lime to prevent damage. One must likewise distance seeds, i.e. one may not plant seeds, and one may not operate the plow, and one must eliminate urine 3 handbreadths from the wall of another, right? So all these activities that you can obviously do on your own property because it's your own property, nevertheless, since it could have a significant impact on your neighbor and his ability to enjoy his property, so these somewhat hazardous activities, the pit, especially the launderer's pit or the mine, or anything that's going to generate heat, like a dump or a pile of manure that can actually generate quite a bit of heat. So these somewhat hazardous activities, you have to have a setback, right? You have to back it away from your property line, from your neighbor's wall, at least 3 handbreadths. I mean, it's not a huge amount of space, right? 3 handbreadths, call it a foot, away from the wall. But you can't bring your pit right up to the wall that you share with your neighbor. Now, the Mishnah continues, and one must distance a mill from a neighbor's wall by a mill, right? So like a mill where you're milling grain and turning it into flour, etc. One must distance a mill from a neighbor's wall by 3 handbreadths from the lower stone of the mill. There's the lower stone and the upper stone that are used to grind the grain. Between them, one must distance this mill from a neighbor's wall by 3 handbreadths from the lower stone of the mill, which is 4 handbreadths from the upper stone of the mill, since the upper stone is smaller than the lower stone. And there must be a distance of 3 handbreadths from the protruding base of an oven until the wall, which is 4 handbreadths from the narrow upper rim of the oven. So just a couple of illustrations here. Somewhat help us understand. There's the lower and upper millstone. And you can see the upper millstone is a little bit smaller. These, I don't know if you can see in this image, they look very, uneven surfaces. I think what we're talking about here is an archaeological find where they found very old upper and lower millstone. I think when they were actually used by the farmers, they were quite a bit smoother than that. That's a launderer's pond. And this is, when we're talking about an oven in the Talmud, it's this clay oven that looks like that. And the point is, you're going to have something that's going to become very hot, so you need this setback from the neighbor's wall. That's the Mishnah. Now the Gemara, and we're on page 17b. I should have mentioned that, we started chapter 2. Now we're on page 17b. Now the Gemara says, the Tana of the Mishnah opens by speaking of a pit. Okay? And he says a person may not dig a pit close to the pit of another, and yet he ends with a reference to a wall, unless he distances it from the wall of another. So what are we talking about? Are we distancing our pit from my neighbor's pit? Or are we distancing my pit from my neighbor's wall? It seems like it was a little bit inconsistent in that discussion in the Mishnah. So why not let the Tana teach? In other words, why didn't the Tana teach? Unless he distanced his pit or ditch 3 handbreadths from the pit of another, just as he begins his statement by referring to a pit. Why does the Mishnah suddenly mention a wall? So Abaye said, and some say it was Rav Yehuda who said, we learned that the Mishnah means from the wall of his pit. Right? We're talking about the wall of the pit. We are talking about the pit. In other words, one should read the Mishnah like this. Unless he distanced his pit or ditch 3 handbreadths from the wall of another's pit. So the neighbor also built his pit close to the border between the 2 properties, and the Mishnah is teaching that the one digging a pit must distance it 3 handbreadths from the wall of the pit of the other. Right? So simple, the simple bottom line here, your neighbor has a pit, you have a pit. Let's not even talk about the property line for a second. Let's just talk about if there were 2 pits that were dug right next to each other. Now, why do you have a pit? Maybe you're storing stuff in the pit. Maybe it's an open pit mine, kind of small mining operation. Maybe you're putting refuse in there. Maybe you're going to use it for something else, like storing grain. Maybe you're going to make a cistern and hold water in there. There's many different reasons why you might dig a pit. Bottom line, if 2 pits are too close to each other, well, then that wall that you need to be sturdy is now going to be, too flimsy, right? And it could collapse. And no doubt, we don't want the contents of our pit, to intermingle with the contents of my neighbor's pit. Maybe he's storing, chemicals for the tanning process in his pit, and I'm storing food in my pit, right? Clearly, we don't want any contamination of that, and that's why we're going to make sure that the wall is sufficiently thick, right? That there's going to be structural integrity for both pits without coming too close to each other. I'm sorry. Abaye said, and some say it was Rav Yehuda who said, we learned that the Mishnah just read that. Okay, now the Gemara challenges. But even so, let it teach, unless he distances excavations 3 handbreadths from the pit of another, and one would understand that the term pit is referring to the wall of the other person's pit. But he didn't say that. So the Gemara responds by using the phrase from the wall of another. This teaches us incidentally that the wall of a pit must be at least 3 handbreadths thick, as the wall of the other's pit occupied the full 3 handbreadths between the cavity of his pit and the property of his neighbor. And the practical difference of this observation is with regard to buying and selling, as it is taught in a Baraisa with regard to one who says to another, I am selling you a pit and its walls, so the wall of the pit must be at least 3 handbreadths thick. Less than that, it's an inadequate pit. Okay? Now we're going to go on to a little bit different subject. it was stated, with regard to one who comes to dig any of these excavations or place any of the items listed in the Mishnah close to the boundary of his field, where his neighbor currently has no pit, Abaye says he may dig or place them close to the boundary. And Rava says he may not dig or place them close to his boundary. Right? So in other words, if you're saying that it's not the wall that separates my property from my neighbor's property, we're not talking about the property line. It's just that we have to have a certain distance between my pit and my neighbor's pit. Well, then if my neighbor has no pit, then why can't I dig my pit right up to the property line? And the answer will be, well, but what if he wants to put his pit near the property line? Now he can't. Okay, well, I dug my pit first. So now he's got to respect that 3 handbreadths distance. Since I dug a pit first and put it near the property line, he's going to have to do the setback. Or do we say that there needs to be some respect of my neighbor and his property and his freedom to dig a pit somewhat near the property line? And so maybe I need to have, that half distance setback, a handbreadth and a half minimum from the property line, so that he could do the same if he were to choose to dig a pit later. So let's see. So they disagree, right? Abaye says he may dig it close to the boundary, and Rava says he may not. So the Gemara explains, all agree that he may not dig or place them close to a field of his neighbor if that field is designated for digging pits, as he will thereby restrict his neighbor from using his field in the manner it is expected to be used. And where they disagree, it is with regard to a field that is not designated for digging pits. There's no reason to believe that my neighbor will ever dig a pit. And the Gemara explains, Abaye says he may dig these excavations or place these items close to the boundary, as the neighbor's field is not designated for pits, so he is not causing any damage to the neighbor by doing so. Rava says he may not dig these excavations so close to the boundary, as the neighbor can say to him, well, just as you changed your mind and dug a pit, I too might change my mind and dig a pit, and I will no longer be able to dig near my border if you put your pit so close to the boundary. Now, there are those who say a different version of this discussion. All agree that one may dig these excavations or place these items close to the boundary of a field that is not designated for digging pits. And when they disagree, it is with regard to a field that is designated for digging pits. And Abaye says one may dig these excavations or place them close to the boundary. And this is the law, even according to the opinion of the rabbis, who say in the Mishna on page 25b that one must distance a tree 25 cubits from a cistern, lest the roots of the tree grow and damage a neighbor's cistern in his field. And the difference is that there it is prohibited, as when he plants the tree, there is already a cistern. But here, at the time when he digs his cistern, there is as yet no cistern in his neighbor's field. And Rava says one may not dig these excavations or place these items close to the boundary, and this is the law, even according to the opinion of Rabbi Yosef, who says in the same Mishnah, this one may dig in his field and that one may plant in his field, i.e. one need not distance his tree for fear of damaging his neighbor's field through expanding roots. And the reason that Rava maintains that his ruling is correct, even according to the opinion of Rabbi Yosef, is that this matter applies only there, as when he plants the tree, its roots, which might damage the cistern, are not yet present. Consequently, when he plants, he does not cause any damage. But here, the neighbor can say to him, each and every strike of yours with the hoe loosens my earth, and therefore you are already causing damage as you dig your cistern if you're putting it too close to our boundary. And so the Gemara suggests a proof. We learn in the Mishnah that a person may not dig a pit close to the pit of another unless he does so at a distance of 3 handbreadths from his neighbor's wall. And the Gemara analyzes this statement. So apparently the reason he may not dig close to the boundary of his neighbor's field is that there is a pit there, from which it may be inferred that if there's no pit, then he may dig his pit close to his neighbor's wall. So granted, according to that second version of the dispute, in which you said all agree that one may dig these excavations or place these items close to the boundary of a field that is not designated for digging pits, one can explain that the Mishnah is referring to a field that is not designated for digging pits. But according to that first version of the dispute in which you said that they disagree with regard to a field that is not designated for digging pits, there is a difficulty. Granted, this works out well according to the opinion of Abaye, who says that one may dig one's pit near the boundary when the neighbor has no pit. But according to the opinion of Rava, who maintains that it is prohibited to dig a pit near the boundary under any circumstances, the ruling of this Mishnah is difficult. So the Gemara explains, Rava could have said to you, wasn't it stated with regard to that Mishnah that Abaye says, and some say it was Rav Yehuda who says, we learned that the Mishnah means from the wall of his pit, not the wall between the properties. And this indicates that the neighbor must distance the edge of his pit from the boundary by the thickness of his wall, which is 3 handbreadths. Therefore, even according to the ruling of the Mishnah, one may not dig his pit directly adjacent to the boundary. Now, there are those who say this discussion in the form of a challenge to the opinion of Abaye. And the Mishnah teaches that one must distance his pit from that of his neighbor, from his neighbor's pit. And it was stated with regard to that ruling that Abaye says, and some say it was Rav Yehuda who says, we learned that it means from the wall of his pit. In other words, the edge of the neighbor's pit must be 3 handbreadths away from the boundary. So presumably it would be 6 handbreadths from pit to pit, but each pit has to be 3 handbreadths from the boundary. Now, granted, according to that first version of the dispute in which you said all agree he may not dig or place them close to a field of his neighbors if that field is designated for digging pits, one can explain that the Mishnah is referring to a field that is designated for digging pits. But according to that second version of the dispute in which you said that they disagree with regard to a field that is designated for digging pits, now we have a difficulty. Granted, this works out well according to the opinion of Rava, who says that it is prohibited to dig a pit near the boundary in this case. But according to the opinion of Abaye, the ruling of this Mishnah is difficult, as if the Mishnah is referring to the wall of the neighbor's pit, it indicates that the first pit was already dug close to the boundary. And the Gemara explains, Abaye could have said to you, the Mishnah is referring to the specific case where both neighbors came to dig their pits at the same time. Consequently, they must both distance their pits from one another. If there is no pit as yet next to the boundary and the neighbor is not digging at that point, one may dig his pit alongside the boundary, right? So bottom line, do you have to, we haven't really said what the answer is, but the bottom line question, do you have to anticipate that your neighbor might dig a pit later and that we have a certain minimum distance between pits, right? And so therefore, because he might want to dig a pit later, you can only bring your pit a certain distance from the wall? Or can you say, well, he doesn't have a pit. He didn't say he was going to dig a pit. There's no reason for me to think that he's going to dig a pit. So I'm going to use my full property, because the bigger my pit is, the more money I can make in my business. So I don't want to have this setback for no reason. I want to dig right up to the boundary. Or can he do that? Or are we going to say, well, no, you have to respect the fact that your neighbor might dig a pit later. You can't come so close to the boundary. You have to leave a setback so that at least there's going to be, after you dig your pit, if he wants to dig a pit, he can use the max amount of his property and leaving this 3 handbreadths distance between the pits. Now, the Gemara suggests, come and hear a proof from a Baraisa. In the case of a rock that is so soft that it crumbles in one's hands and no tool is needed, this one may dig his pit from here and that one may dig his pit from there. This one distances his pit 3 handbreadths and plasters with lime, and that one distances his pit 3 handbreadths and plasters with lime. And this indicates that the first one who digs a pit must distance his pit even when the second one does not yet have a pit. But the Gemara rejects this as a proof. Rock that crumbles in one's hand, this is different than digging in the dirt. In this case, one must maintain a distance from the boundary due to the softness of the ground. Here we're talking about ground that is much less stable than the normal kind of ground. And the Gemara is puzzled by this exchange. And he who asked it, why did he ask it? Meaning, the Baraisa is explicitly referring to rock that crumbles in one's hands, so this is clearly a unique case. And the Gemara answers that the sage who asked the question assumed that the law of the Baraisa includes all types of soil, and he thought that it was necessary for the Tana to mention the specific example of rock that crumbles in one's hand, as it could enter your mind to say that since this substance crumbles in one's hands, he is required to keep his pit an even greater distance away from the boundary. To counter this, the Baraisa teaches us that a distance of 3 handbreadths is sufficient. So the Gemara suggests, come in here a proof from the Mishnah. One must distance the solid residue of produce that has been pressed free of its oil, and animal manure, and salt, and lime, and rocks 3 handbreadths from the wall of another, or he can plaster the wall with lime. Now we're on page 18a. Now, the Gemara analyzes this statement. The reason for this ruling is that there is a wall there belonging to his neighbor from which it may be inferred that if there is no wall, one may place these substances close to the boundary of his neighbor's courtyard. Well, this presents a difficulty for the opinion of Rava, according to the first version of the dispute, which states that one may not place these substances close to a boundary, even in the case of a field that is not designated for pits, because now we're talking about not just a pit, but a pit with a somewhat hazardous substance in it. So you would say, well, okay, because of the substance in it, I could understand a bigger setback. And how is that going to interrelate with the established law and with the law and with the situation where the neighbor has not designated his field for digging pits? The Gemara says, no, we're not going to be able to learn out from these pits with hazardous substances in them. Why? No, even if there is no wall, one may also not place these substances close to the boundary. Rather, because they're hazardous. So rather, what does mentioning a wall here in this, with regard to these hazardous substances, what does that teach us? This teaches us that all these substances are damaging to a wall, and that's why you're going to need a thicker wall. The Gemara suggests, come in here, a different proof from the Mishnah. One must distance seeds and the plow and urine 3 handbreadths from the wall of another. The Gemara analyzes this ruling. The reason for this ruling is that there is a wall from which it may be inferred that if there is no wall, one may place these substances close to the boundary of the field. But the Gemara says no. Even if there is no wall, one may also not place these substances close to the boundary because they can leak out, or in the case of roots from seeds, grow out into the neighbor's property, right? This is a hazardous substance. One may not place these items close to the boundary. But so the Gemara asks, but rather, what does this teach us? And this teaches us that dampness is damaging to a wall. So we still don't have an answer. Come in here another proof from the Mishnah. And one must distance a mill from a wall by 3 handbreadths from the lower millstone, or 4 handbreadths from the upper stone. And the Gemara analyzes this statement. The reason for this ruling is that there is a wall, right? There is a wall of the neighbor, meaning the neighbor has a neighboring pit, from which it may be inferred. But if there was no wall of the neighbor, if there was no neighboring pit, then you could place the mill close to the boundary. But the Gemara says no, even if there is no wall, one may also not place his mill close to the boundary. But rather, what does this teach us? It teaches us that vibrations are damaging to a wall, right? Why can you not put a mill close to the boundary of your neighbor? Because when it's grinding, going round and round, it creates a vibration close to the earth, and that vibration travels through the ground, and it can damage a wall. Makes perfect sense. So, what is the distance that we're required? We don't know yet. Come in here another proof from the Mishnah. And the oven must be distanced 3 handbreadths from the base, which is 4 handbreadths from the upper rim of the oven. And the reason for this ruling is that there is a wall. But if there was no wall, then we could place it right up next to the boundary? No. Even if there is no wall, one may not place an oven close to the boundary. And what does this teach us? This teaches us that heat is damaging to a wall. So come in here a different proof from the Mishnah. The Mishnah on page 20b. A person may not open a bakery or a dye shop beneath the wine storeroom of another person, nor may one open a cattle barn there. And the Gemara analyzes this Mishnah, and the reason for this ruling is that there is a storeroom already in place from which it may be inferred that if there's no storeroom, one may do so. If this is the case, then with regard to a pit as well, one may dig next to a boundary if there is no pit in your neighbor's property. But the Gemara challenges this and says the case of a residence is different. As in general, one can use his domicile in any manner of his choosing unless he directly causes damage to another or his property. So the language of the Mishnah is also precise, as an explicit baraisa is taught with regard to that Mishnah. If the construction of the cattle barn preceded the storeroom, it is permitted. Nothing can be inferred from the case of the baraisa with regard to the law of the Mishnah, which does not concern living quarters. We can't learn out from a zoning ordinance having to do with how close you can bring a cattle barn to somebody else's residence, because they were talking about living quarters. Where there's a different expectation than when we're talking about, in a more commercial part of the city, when we're talking about a commercial pit being close to the boundary where the neighbor is not digging pits in his property, but he might choose to dig one later. So we can't learn out laws of commercial properties and pits from a law of residential restrictions and requirements. And by the way, I'll never forget Nina's dad of blessed memory, Jaime Davidovich. He's such a great guy. I really miss him, and a great artist. And in his work, he traveled all over the world and went to China several times. And I remember him describing to me that, New York City and, my goodness, L.A., so many zoning requirements and restrictions, what you can do, what you can't do with your property, because you might cause a problem someday that maybe, the water from your property might not, whatever. It's like, it's so egregious, the amount of laws and regulations, that it makes it very hard to build anything. But in China, not the case. Maybe things have changed, from when Jaime was there. I mean, he was there 20 years ago, maybe 15. But he was telling me that there are cities in China where you have high-rise buildings, and one floor is all apartments, residential, hundreds of people living there. And the floor above it is a chemical factory, and the floor below it is a paint factory. I mean, something you just never see in America. We're just so accustomed to benefiting, from a vigorous zoning board. But, there's other places in the world where they don't have that. And now you can see that the sages, were just way ahead of the curve in the sense that thousands of years ago, they were already talking about what you can and cannot do on your property if it's going to infringe on the rights and the right to, quiet enjoyment of the neighbor's property. Okay. The case of residence is different. So we still haven't said what is the setback from your pit to the neighbor's wall. Is it the full 3 handbreadths or not? Is it 3 handbreadths from his pit, 3 handbreadths from the boundary? We still don't know. So come in here a proof from a Mishna on page 26a. A person may not plant a tree close to another person's field unless he distances it 4 cubits from his neighbor. That's quite a bit more than 3 handbreadths, but a tree has roots. And it is taught with regard to this Mishnah, the 4 cubits of which the sages spoke are to enable the work of the vineyard, i.e. a small space next to the trees is necessary to enable animals to plow between them. So the Gemara analyzes this, and the reason this distance is required is due to the work of the vineyard, from which we can infer that if not for the problem due to the work of the vineyard, it would be permitted for one to plant his tree close to the boundary. And apparently this is the law even if there are roots of the tree that damage his neighbor's field. It's not that we're making the 4 cubit setback because the tree's roots might grow into the neighbor's property. Rather, it's because the neighbor might have a vineyard and he needs to move his animal along the side of the vineyard, and he can actually use my property to move his animal through that. That's interesting. And the Gemara answers, with what are we dealing here? We are dealing with a case where a hard rock, tsunema, interrupts between the 2 fields, preventing the roots from passing through to the other field. But presumably that wasn't there, then the roots would be a problem. And the language of the Mishnah is also precise with regard to this point, as it teaches further on, if there was a fence between them, then this one places, meaning he can plant a tree close to the fence from here, and that one can plant a tree close to from there. So the Baraisa was referring to a case where the roots could travel across. How could it be permitted for both neighbors to plant their trees alongside each other? Consequently, it must be referring to a situation where there's a rock wall that separates between the two fields below the surface of the soil, and therefore the neighbors may plant their trees near the fence. Like the story I told you of our bamboo that ended up escaping because the developer next door, we built a wall to, stop our, bamboo roots from going across to the neighbor. But then the developer raised the level of the soil in the backyard, and then the bamboo escaped, the roots escaped, it became a big problem. And we ended up removing all of the bamboo because we wanted to have good neighborly relations. But this idea of having a barrier to prevent roots from crossing from one property to another, again, ancient problem that they were dealing with thousands of years ago. And the Gemara responds, if so, that's what you were talking about, the barrier in the soil, say the last clause of that Mishnah, that if the roots of the tree extended into the field of another, the neighbor may cut them off to a depth of 3 handbreadths so that they do not impede the plow. And the Gemara asks, but if a rock interrupts between the two fields and forms a barrier, what are these roots doing there? How did they get there? The Gemara answers, this is what the Tana of the Mishnah is saying. And if there is no rock and the roots of the tree extended into the field of another, the neighbor may cut them off to a depth of 3 handbreadths so that they do not impede the plow. So have we learned out about how close we can put a pit to a boundary? Not yet. Come and hear a proof from the Mishna on page 25b. One must distance a tree 25 cubits from a cistern, right? Because a tree's roots want to find the source of water. That's what a cistern is. It's a pit in the ground that holds water. So that would be very harmful to such a pit. So when we're talking about a water cistern, then you need 25 cubit setback. That's quite a bit of distance. That's 40 feet, from the neighbor's cistern. Okay, so what about that? So the reason for this ruling seems to be that there is a cistern. And from that, we would infer that if there is no cistern, then one may plant this tree close to the neighbor's field. And the Gemara says, no, even when there is no cistern, one may also not plant close to the neighbor's field. And by mentioning a cistern, the Tana taught us that the roots of a tree extend and damage the cistern up to a distance of 25 cubits away. But that doesn't mean that in the absence of a cistern, you could put your tree right next to the boundary. And if so, say that the last clause of the Mishnah, and if the tree preceded the cistern, one is not required to cut down the tree. But if one may not place the tree close to the boundary, even if there is no cistern, then how can you find the case where the tree preceded the cistern? Why would its owner not be required to cut it down? And the Gemara answers, this is as Rav Papa says. With regard to a similar matter, it is referring to a buyer who purchases part of a field. So too, here it is referring to a buyer. In other words, a field contained a cistern and a tree alongside each other belonging to the same owner. And the owner sold part of the field containing the cistern. And then it was too close to the property of another and they had to cut down the tree. So we don't know yet about pits. Come and hear a proof from a Mishnah on page 25a. One must distance the water in which flax is steeped from vegetables growing in a neighbor's field, and one must distance leeks from onions growing in the neighbor's field, and one must likewise distance mustard from bees that are in a neighbor's field. So the Gemara analyzes this, and the reason is that there are vegetables present, from which it may be inferred that if there were no vegetables, one could place the water close to the neighbor's field. The Gemara says, no, even if there are no vegetables, one may also not place his water, meaning the water in which he soaks flax, which acquires a chemical residue, close to the neighbor's field. And the Tana teaches us that these items mentioned in that Mishnah are harmful to each other. Mustard plants are harmful to bees. If somebody's a beekeeper and he's keeping bees. and that leeks and onions can harm each other, and water in which flax is steeped can harm vegetables. These things need to be kept far apart. So the Gemara says, well, if so, say that the last clause of that Mishnah, where it says on page 25a that Rabbi Yosei renders it permitted to plant near the neighbor's bees in the case of mustard, as explained in the Baraisa, this is because he can say to the owner of the bees, just as you say to me, keep your mustard away from my bees, I can say to you, keep your bees away from my mustard, as they come and eat my mustard plants. In other words, we are mutually harmful to each other. Okay, my mustard is harmful to your bees, and your bees are harmful to my mustard. So why are you going to say that I have to keep back from the boundary? We both have to keep back from the boundary. It's not that I'm going to lose more of my property than you're going to lose of yours because mustard is harmful to bees. Mustard is harmful to bees. Bees are harmful to mustard. We need to stay apart, but we're going to split the difference, right? It's not that one of us loses more of his property. Now on page 18b. And if one may not place an item that might cause damage close to his neighbor's boundary, how can you find a case where each neighbor is damaging the property of the other? And Rav Papa says this is referring to a buyer who purchased part of his neighbor's field, and it contains a substance or items that might cause damage. For example, water in which flax is steeped, or mustard. So in the other section of the field, the neighbor retained an item or substance that could be damaged. So in this manner, it is possible for the item that causes damage to be found near the boundary of the neighbor without one of them having violated the ruling of the Mishnah, right? In other words, when somebody planted these things that are harmful to each other very close together, well, they were both on his property, so he didn't harm anybody else. But then he sold a portion of his field, and so the result was now you have two different landowners with these harmful substances too close to each other. No one, violated this ordinance when he created one or the other. You could say, because if my neighbor has bees and I put the mustard close to the boundary, now he can complain because he was there first. But if no one violated anything because it was just one piece of property when the two things were installed and then part of the property was sold, that's how we arrive at this case. But then what do? These things are harming each other. Who has to move? Do they both have to move? Okay. Now the Gemara asks, if this is referring to a buyer, what is the reason of, in other words, somebody bought a portion of a field and that's how these harmful things ended up near each other. If this is referring to a buyer's situation, what is the reason of the rabbis who say that the neighbor can demand that the buyer distance that which causes damage? After all, he has not acted improperly. And furthermore, what is the reason of Rabbi Yosei for disagreeing only in the case of the mustard and the bees? Even the case of water in which flax is steeped and vegetables, this is also subject to the same reasoning. Why should the buyer of this portion of the field have to distance his water considering that he did not act improperly? And Ravina said the explanation is as follows. The rabbis hold that the responsibility falls on the one who causes damage to distance himself. The one who has the potential to cause damage must act to prevent the damage from occurring. It's not that the vegetables are going to harm my water in which flax is steeped. It's that my water in which flax is steeped could end up harming my neighbor's vegetables. So even though I bought this field that contains the pit with the water for flax from my neighbor, so when he created the vegetable patch and the flax steeping pit, he put them too close to each other, but it was his property, so that was his business. Now that he sold me a portion of the field, and I bought along with it this pit of water in which flax is steeped, now it's too close to his vegetable patch in the part of the field that he retained for himself. Why does it fall on me to move the pit? Because the pit with the water in it that could leak out, right, that's what could potentially damage. He's not going to damage me, I'm going to damage him, and that's why it's on me to move the pit. The Gemara asks, so does this prove by inference that Rabbi Yosei, who disagrees with the ruling of the rabbis, holds that the responsibility falls on the one whose property is being damaged to distance himself? I mean, if you have a problem that you're worried that my water is going to harm your vegetables, so move your vegetable patch. Why do I have to move my pit? Is that what Rabbi Yosei is saying? But if the responsibility to distance oneself falls on the one whose property would be damaged, even in the case of water in which flax is steeped and vegetables, the owner should also not have to distance himself, meaning the one with the pit. Why does Rabbi Yosef distinguish between that situation and the case of bees and mustard? So rather, actually, Rabbi Yosef also holds that the responsibility to distance oneself is on the one who causes the damage, not the one who's afraid he'll be damaged. The obligation to remove yourself from the boundary, set back further, is on the one who causes the damage. And Rabbi Yosef would agree with that. And this is what Rabbi Yosef is saying to the rabbis. Your explanation works out well with regard to water in which flax is steeped and vegetables, where the one who causes the damage must distance himself, as this damages that. But that doesn't damage this, right? The water in which flax is steeped could damage the vegetables, but the vegetables don't damage the water in which flax is steeped. That's why the one with the water pit in which flax is steeped, he has to move that pit back. But, would say Rabbi Yosef, in the case of mustard and bees, they both damage one another. The mustard can damage the bees, and the bees can damage the mustard. So in light of this factor, and since the initial planting of the mustard was permitted, because this is a case where the field, a portion of it was sold, and that's how the owner ended up having it, he didn't do anything wrong. In this case, the owner of the bees should distance them from the mustard. But I don't understand why it isn't on both of them, but let's keep going. And as for the rabbis, how do they respond to this claim? They maintain that bees do not damage mustard. Their reasoning is that if it is referring to a seed, the bees will not find it. And if it is referring to a leaf, it will grow back. And therefore, no damage has been caused. I'm a little bit perplexed when we're talking about bees damaging plants. I mean, they're not like, the kind of ants or other, pests that eat up a plant. Do bees eat plants? I don't think they do. Maybe it's a different kind of bee. But at any rate, the Gemara asks, and does Rabbi Yosef hold that the responsibility falls on the one who causes damage to distance himself? But didn't we learn in a Mishna on page 25b that Rabbi Yosef says, even though the cistern preceded the tree, the owner need not cut down the tree, as this one digs a cistern in his property and that one plants a tree in his property. So rather, actually, Rabbi Yosef holds that the responsibility falls on the one whose property might be damaged to distance himself. As long as a guy is, planting a tree or digging a cistern on his own property, he could do whatever he wants. If he's afraid that the neighbor's thing will damage him, so he should set back his tree or his, or he should set back his cistern. And Rabbi Yosef spoke to the rabbis in accordance with their statement, not his own holding. I'm almost done. Questions or comments, please get them in now. So the Gemara elaborates, Rabbi Yosef was saying to the rabbis, in my opinion, the responsibility falls on the one whose property might be damaged to distance himself so that his property won't be damaged. And therefore, even in the case of water in which flax is steeped in vegetables, the owner of the water need not distance himself. But according to your opinion, that the responsibility does fall on the one who causes damage to distance himself, this works out well with regard to water in which flax is steeped in vegetables, as these damage those and those don't damage these. But mustard and bees both damage one another, and if the mustard owner acted properly, the owner of the bees should be required to move his bees. And the Gemara continues, and how did the rabbis respond to this claim? They hold that bees do not damage mustard. If this is referring to seed, the bees will not find it, and if it is referring to a leaf, it will grow back. And that's where we'll stop. And we are right at the top of page 19a, where God willing, we'll pick it up tomorrow night. In the last few Saturdays, I've been getting on by about like 9:35, 9:40, and I'll aim for the same. Shabbos is going to gradually start to end earlier and earlier, and then it'll be more sane for our friends on the East Coast. Okay, let me take a few questions if we have them. Looks like just one question from Sharon. How does one sell a pit? Is the surrounding property also being sold? I would presume so, right? I mean, it's interesting, right? We have learned that you could, sell the date palms on your property, right? And I presumably you would give the new owner of the trees some kind of an easement through your land so he could come and harvest the dates. But you could sell the trees without the underlying property. So perhaps you could actually sell the pit itself, which has some kind of commercial use, and not sell the surrounding property. But you would have to, I'm sure, grant some kind of an easement so that the guy, could use the pit. And then he would have a pit. And then when he buys the pit, is he then going to inherit the problem that the pit is too close, to your land? Well, I mean, that's what you sold to him. But maybe, what happens, this is what often happens, right? Like, in fact, where we live right here in LA, it's a bunch of, single family houses with quite small lots. But 200 years ago, this was a massive ranch, that belonged to, I forget the guy's name, but he's we know his name because now there are streets in this part of LA named after him. I can't remember what the guy's name was. But, it was over time divided and divided and divided and divided. And so at one point, it was all belonged to one person. He could do whatever he wanted on his land. Later, as it became divided, into single family properties, then you brought in these zoning ordinances, and then people who didn't do anything wrong could end up having something on their properties that is a hazard to the neighbor's property. And then the question is, whose obligation is it going to be to remedy that situation? Okay, that's what I've got for us today. And with God's help, we'll be together again tomorrow night, as early as I can make it, but about 9:35, 9:40. Which everybody should have a wonderful, uplifting, inspiring, rejuvenating,